Broadcasting from the beautiful state of Maine, welcome to another episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast, the show that focuses on identifying and developing the skills and behaviors that will inspire, empower, and compel others to follow your lead. Listen as Patrick's guests talk about the powerful leadership approaches they have identified and developed, which are vital for leading in today's challenging times. These are the same approaches that will positively impact you as a leader too. Learning from Leaders provides the right balance of leadership research with real-world scenarios, making it easy for you to rise above your best. All right, let's start the show.
Hey everybody, Patrick Verino here. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Learning from Leaders. And on today's episode, this is with author Luca Dellanna. And he wrote a book called The Control Heuristic. And I love this book. I think there's so much value to it, whether you're a leader or an employee, talking about what motivates us to do what we do, or really what holds us back. And we'll talk about a concept he talks about, the expected emotional outcome, as well as many other topics around really, I think, how do we become better at whatever stage that we're at. I think you're really going to enjoy this. There are so many pearls in this. So let's jump into it. Luca, I want to thank you for taking the time to be on the Learning from Leaders podcast. I will tell you, I've loved reading your book, The Control Heuristic. I couldn't wait to get you on this podcast. I know I reached out to you a few months ago in regards to being able to set this up. So thank you for being on the podcast. And I know this will be valuable for those that are listening to this.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Patrick.
I thought maybe we could just start it out. I've mentioned the title a couple times to people that I've been working with. And I think some of them don't understand, well, what is a heuristic? So I thought maybe we could just start there.
Yes. So for me, a heuristic is almost like a rule of thumb. So it's a very, very simple rule to take decisions. And the point of the heuristic is that it's not always right, but if we assume that it's right, we get better outcomes than otherwise. And the reason is because heuristics sometimes, they do not try to get every single decision right. So they look like they might have some bias. They might have some risk conservation bias. And some people might think it's irrational. But actually what we see is that if we follow heuristics, we usually survive more, we get better long-term decisions, even if in the short term it looks a little bit irrational.
Yeah. In one point of this, you say, from a control heuristic, people behave to feel like they are controlling the risk their ancestors were vulnerable to. To me, the thing that I picked out on that was, right, we feel that we're doing that, but do we really do that?
Yeah, exactly. So one of the chapters in my book is about the fact that contrary to common belief, we do not seek survival. Our behavior, our instincts do not seek survival. What they seek is the feeling of survival. So if you think about it, all rational or irrational behaviors that we do, when they do not bring more survival, what they bring is that usually the feeling of survival. And there is a very good reason why. Because of course, who we are now depends on the genes that have been selected by natural selection over the millennia. The thing is that we do not have any gene for decision making. We have genes that describe how our brain is made, and then our brain takes decision. So what we select, we do not select the decision making process from natural selection, but we select the genes that produce a brain that took the decision that led to more survival. And the thing is, how does our brain interact with reality and take decision? It's through emotions and feelings. And in particular, the rule in our brain is that we tend to do more of the actions that when we complete them, they create a release of some neurotransmitters in our brain, of some chemicals. So what happens is that the brain that releases neurochemicals after we do an action which increases survival is the brain that will tend to do more of the action and get selected. But what we select is the release of neurotransmitters, of neurochemicals. So what we get selected for, what we evolved for, is to feel survival, feel like we are increasing our survival with the right decisions. And when you think about it, a lot of bad decisions that we take nowadays, for example, eating too much sugar, they are decisions that come because we feel good when we eat sugars, because sugars used to increase our survival in the past, because nutrition was scarce.
Yeah.
And nowadays the nutrition is abundant, it's the other way around.
It's so fascinating. I love your thoughts. Right. So think about the last 2 years in regards to dealing with COVID, decisions that have been made for individuals, whether it's getting vaccinated, not getting vaccinated, wearing masks, not wearing masks. How do you sort of tie this in with that DNA belief?
Well, COVID is a great example. I believe that every one of us took the decision that they felt increased their survival the most. So people who would feel like walking indoors without a mask would decrease their chances of survival would probably be more likely to wear a mask. And people who would feel that wearing a mask would constrain them and they would feel the same emotions that they associate to, to being constrained, to not having freedom and so on, they are the ones that are less likely to wear the mask.
Yeah.
So the thing is that we realize that we all look what feels like survival and that we all optimize that. But then because we feel different things, we take different decisions.
So I want to come back to that at the end in regards to your book, where you talk about these hypotheses that didn't make it into your book, but were just sort of thoughts that you have, because one really stuck out to me as it relates to that. The thing that I have found most valuable as I read your book in the work that I do was around expected emotional outcomes. I'd never heard that concept before, but it made so much sense to me. And I think I've heard it in other ways, but for whatever reason, that just resonated with me in regards to why we do or don't do certain things. I was wondering if we could really have a discussion on that. If you could expand around, how did that evolve for you?
Yes, so the overarching principle of human behavior is that we only take actions for which we have a positive expected emotional outcome. So I'm going to simplify this a lot, but basically there are two parts in our brain which relate to taking action. There is one part which makes decisions. Decides, for example, I should go run outside so that I get fitter, for example, I lose weight. But then there is another part which acts like a gate and can prevent us to take actions on decisions that we make. And the gate follows a very simple rule, which is that it opens if the decision has a positive expected emotional outcome and it closes otherwise. So if for me, the idea of running has a positive expected emotional outcome, I will wear my sneakers and go out and run. If instead running has a negative expected emotional outcome, I will not wear my sneakers and go out and run. And maybe I will confabulate some justification. And the point is that the expected emotional outcome always relates to the action, not to the result. Because if you think about it, I think that every one of us, or most of us, has a positive expected emotional outcome linked to losing weight and getting fit. But only some of us, they actually take action. And those of us who take action are those who have a positive expected emotional outcome, not with the outcome, getting fitter, but with the action, which could be running outside, going to the gym, and so on. And the same applies to everything in life. And if you think, for example, about organizations, too often managers, they try to incentivize with bonuses, promotions, and so on. But these are incentives on the outcome. What you see as a manager is that a lot of time, even if you offer people a bonus, people will not take action. And the reason is because they do have a positive expected emotional with the expected emotional outcome associated with getting the bonus, but they do not have a positive expected emotional outcome associated with the task that you're asking them to complete. And therefore, they will not work on it, or they will do it just enough not to be fired, but nothing more than that.
Yeah. And to me, that's the part that has been most fascinating about this, especially in the work that I do when I'm working with organizations and leaders and trying to maybe get them to develop new habits. This really has stuck out to me in terms of really, that's what I have to do with them, is to create an environment where that EEO is higher to make change than to constantly or to continue to do what they're doing. And that's what I found just so fascinating about what you're doing. There's a WIFM, and I don't know if you're familiar with that, but an acronym that we used to hear quite often. It's this idea of what's in it for me, right? And it's so true, right? Is that if we can't activate that, right, it becomes very difficult for us to get people to want to change.
Exactly. And let me just clarify one thing. The what's in it for me has to be related to the action, not to the future reward. If you promise people, a promotion at the end of the year, that incentive will only motivate a few people which are already motivated, maybe because they already experience feeling good with a promotion and something like that.
Yeah.
But offering a promotion will not motivate a huge part of the workforce, the ones which are not already motivated, the ones that they do not trust that if they do the work, a promotion will follow, and so on.
Yeah.
And if we want to go to motivate those people, then the solution is not to think about the long term, about how can I incentivize them at the end of the year and something like that, but it's about thinking just about the task at hand. If we want, for example, an employee to make some sales calls, the question is, how do I make sure that he has a positive and expected emotional outcome associated with making the sales call? Not with the reward if he reaches his quota, with making the sales call. And then the solution is to ask yourself why he might feel bad while making the sales call, and how do I teach him to associate a positive emotional outcome with making the sales call? And the solution usually is some form of coaching and training so that we ensure that he's good at making the sales call. He makes the sales call. Something good happens after the sales call immediately. For example, the client saying yes. And he gets the adrenaline rush, for example, from the client saying yes, not from himself getting the bonus at the end of the year. And if he gets the client to say yes and he gets the satisfaction of doing that, then he will be more likely of doing more sales call, for example.
So two things, because I think this is so important in the environment that we're in right now around employees feeling engaged or not engaged. And, a lot of work by Gallup, the Gallup organization, one of their tools that they use is called the Q12. And in that tool, one of the 12 questions they ask is from individuals, really, how often have they been recognized for good work that they've been doing? And it asks them, has it happened in the last 7 days? I think that's where we miss an opportunity, right? We're not consistently reinforcing positive behaviors or what's good to keep people going. Because if it's 12 months away, that's a long time for most people if I'm not being reinforced along the way.
Exactly. And let me explicit what happens in the mind of the employee. The employee does something good on Monday. If by Tuesday he's not acknowledged, on Tuesday he will learn the lesson that efforts are not rewarded in this company.
I love it.
I mean, not consciously, unconsciously.
Right.
But that's what happens. And therefore, the number one thing that I teach managers is to give early feedback. The moment that you catch your employee right doing something good, that's the moment you should acknowledge them.
Yeah. And it's not to sound crude, but it's very much like training animals. Like a dog, you can't reprimand a dog 3 hours after it did something that was disruptive. If it got into the trash and you find out 3 hours and then you go over and scold the dog, it doesn't equate the two things. And the same thing with the reward, right? If it doesn't happen close to it, it doesn't know how to reinforce that.
Exactly. I love this example. Imagine the absurdity of training your dog by having end of the day performance review with your dog. That would just not work. Then, of course, people, they have a much longer attention span. But still, it must happen by the end of the day or at most the following day. Not at the end of the week, not at the end of the month, not at the end of the year.
Yeah. Then there really is some fascinating research in regards to motivating kids that when we recognize their effort versus the outcome of that effort, the grades that they got, the kids that were recognized for effort tended to perform better. And I think it falls in line with what you're saying, right? Is we're not worried about the lagging indicator. We're looking at what the leading indicators are. And that's the effort is what we can control, whether it's kids in school or adults in a work setting. We're recognizing the input.
Yes, so on workplaces, I would be careful not to excessively reward effort in absence of results, because then you get people who get great at showing effort, even if it doesn't bring results. So instead, what I suggest people to do is to break down the tasks into subtasks or break down the metrics into smaller metrics. So for example, sales calls. I take an example. You want to break it down in pieces. And for example, you want to say, I love that you made your research before you called the decision maker. I love that during the call, you asked a lot of questions to really understand the need of the customer or whatnot. So we are not rewarding efforts. We're rewarding small outcomes or actions or behaviors. We reward behaviors. We reward good behavior, not effort. Yeah, that's the thing. We reward good behavior, not effort.
You bring up a good point there when I talk about effort. And I think what can happen too in organizations where there's this cynicism that everybody gets a trophy when nothing really has happened. I think there's got to be a balance there. So I think, I fully agree with that aspect of it. So I'd be curious, Luca, in this environment, I think what I see organizations struggle with quite often is the performance management review, right? What that process is. And And I'd love your thoughts on it, because I think it's one of these tools that is just a huge missed opportunity within organizations because it's not managed properly. It's not put together properly. But I'd love your thoughts, especially as it relates to this conversation. How would you do it?
So for me, I would have many performance reviews, not once a year. Very minimum once a quarter, probably better once every 2 months. So one thing is that if I have 6 performance reviews instead of 1 during the year, I have 6 chances to give people small objectives, attainable objectives, to correct if they're going in the wrong directions. I have 6 chances for them to improve. So the learnings will compound much faster. That's the first thing. If one of my people is underperforming, but they do not know it, I want to tell them early. Because if I tell them early, they can just step up their productivity. If I'm telling them at the end of the year, they will be very frustrated if they were expecting a bonus and then they don't get it.
Yeah.
So have very frequent performance reviews. Now, when I tell people to have a performance review every 2 months, they tell me that I'm crazy. And the reason they tell me that I'm crazy is because they think that people will ask for raises 6 times a year, will ask for promotion 6 times a year, and something like that. So the key is raises and promotions are usually given and asked during the December performance review. That said, we still have 5 more performance review every 2 months, which are purely to discuss your progress, whether you're on path to get the bonus, promotion, or whatnot at the end of the year.
Yeah.
That's how it should work, in my opinion.
So, and along those lines, what I would hear most often is people saying, I don't have time to do that many touches in regards to this topic. And my experience has been that it takes less time if you do it more often. Then to me, it reminds me when you do it at the end of the year, and this is how I would often describe it. I say, and in the US, I would say, imagine if I was on the East Coast and I was driving to the West Coast and I got in my car and I said, it's going to take me 12 days to get there. I point my car in the direction of the West Coast and I just start driving and I don't have to get out of my car to see where I am until the 11th month. The likelihood that I'm going to get to the West Coast where I wanted to go is really not that great because I haven't checked anywhere along the way to see, am I still on track? Am I still going in the right direction? And I think that's oftentimes what happens in performance management is that we set goals, we set objectives, and then in my experience, the companies that I see will in the 11th month in November decide to then look at where are people in regards to what they said they were going to do for the year. And if you're off course, if you haven't come close, there's no way that you're going to be able to course correct to be able to meet your objectives in a month. It's like cramming for an exam. And exactly. I think that's the frustration with it. I think it's such a vital tool, the way you described it. There's so much value that we can get from it when there are more touch points, like you mentioned.
Exactly. And on this, I will tell you one more thing. So my background is in manufacturing. For almost a decade, I've been working with managers in manufacturing. And one of the things that I tell them is that once per week, they should go on the production line, check what's going on, look for people that are doing good things, tell them that they're doing good things, looking for people that are not working up to standard and calling them out. When I tell them that they cannot, usually I tell them like once a week you should do that. And then they tell me, I don't have the time to do that. And then I explain to them that that's exactly because they don't have the time to do that, that whatever they do during the time will be extremely significant.
Yeah.
For example, a lot of manufacturing companies have problems that the workers are not wearing personal protective equipment. If the CEO goes on the production line and takes the time to wear the protective equipment, he will send to everyone the very clear message that he believes that taking the time to wear the protective equipment is an investment worth making.
Yeah.
And the CEO might say, I don't have the time to do that. And my reply is, it's because you don't have the time to do that it's a costly signal. And because it's a costly signal, it's something that will be listened to.
Yeah, it's a paradigm shift for people to do that. And also, in work that I will often do is from a leadership behavior standpoint, to me, the first behavior that we need to demonstrate is congruence. So when you talk about that, if I go down onto the floor and I put all of the equipment on, the personal protective equipment that needs to be, I walk the talk, right? What I say and what I do is the same thing. And I set an example to everybody else that this is important and I'm willing to do it myself. I fully agree with that.
Exactly.
In regards to leadership, and one thing that I really found valuable in your book, and shortly after I read it, I actually sent a post out on it, and it was around increasing self-worth. And I think from a leadership standpoint, a lot of times my focus is first on helping people lead from the inside out. And one of the things that I found really valuable in what you had written about was the exercise of creating self-worth, things that you can do. And to me, it tied in with happiness that you talked about later on. I was wondering if you could talk about that, because I think it's a different twist on how do you develop self-worth and why is that important?
Yeah, so for me, the thing is, let's say that you have an objective. So you will maybe make a plan and you say, I have to take that action so that it will bring me to this objective. And then maybe you discover that you don't take that action because maybe 1 week passed and you didn't take action. That means that the action is too big for you. Maybe you do not believe that you are able to do it, or maybe you do not believe that if you do it, something good will happen or something like that. The solution usually is to get a smaller step. And you do the small step and you will experience that doing the action brings progress. And that's what will build your capacity to take action in the long term. And that's, for example, what for me self-worth means, is this belief that taking action brings progress. And one of the things that I would advise, for example, managers is to build this self-worth in their employees, which doesn't mean building self-worth as in motivating, telling them you're worthy. It means giving them small tasks that are likely to bring in a good outcome, a tangible positive outcome, even if it's too small, so that they experience that taking action brings good results. And that will build the capacity to take action in other contexts.
Yeah. When you talk about that, do you see that as the same thing as building self-efficacy in individuals, where I'm trying to build that belief that I can do this?
Yes, I would say that's the same thing as the belief. So for me, efficacy is more like a know-how thing. Like I'm effective when I know how to do things properly. And instead, self-worth is more like just the belief that taking action in the right way will bring good results.
You talk about happiness as part of that, as a lagging indicator, which I love, right? Because I do think that oftentimes we chase happiness, the outcome, without looking at, it's more important to look at what are the things that if we were to do certain things, happiness, I think it just organically happens by itself. We don't have to chase it. It just becomes part of what we do.
Exactly. And so for me, like one cannot really chase happiness, like by having happiness as like taking short-term actions that they think will bring happiness. For me, like happiness is something that naturally ensues when you take care of your problems, when you know yourself, and when you then get the things that you know that you need. Not necessarily the things that you want, but at least those that you need.
Yeah.
And so for me, like a lot of times when I see people which are unhappy, for me, it means that there is some structural problem in their life that they need to take care of. And they will not get happier for me by, by looking for, by going on holiday. If, for example, if there is a structural problem in their life, but they will get happy if they solve the structural problem.
Yeah. But I think we live in a society, it feels like where that's what we do, right? I mean, in terms of it's the next promotion. Once I get that, I'll be happy. Or it's the new relationship. Once I leave this relationship and start dating this type of person, then I'll be happy. Or once I move into this house or buy this car or have this piece of jewelry, that's the happiness point. And again, the research would suggest, right, we talk about hedonic adaptation, where after about 3 months, that shiny car is just a car again. And it doesn't fulfill that need that you talk about.
Exactly. I think that we are terrible at knowing what we want. Sometimes I make the example of, let's imagine that someone is happily married. Like take the average happily married person. And then there is a genie that appears. And the genie says, you can choose between everyone in the world, one person that will become your next spouse. I am almost sure that everyone will choose someone that will bring them less happiness than the current spouse. And the reason is because there is so much that we do not see about things, about people. And you can see it like right now, to make a very relevant example. There is the story about Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. Johnny Depp probably, he could choose like almost any partner. He was one of the most attractive male people in the planet, and yet he chose terribly. And I think that applies to a lot of people. So for me, it's not like happiness is not much about choosing precisely, but it's more about building yourself and your life in such a way that then naturally happiness and the things that make you happy will naturally come with.
Yeah, that's a whole separate topic too. I think in regards to how we choose people, right? Is it, somebody that says, I can't live without that person, that's not a healthy relationship, as opposed to somebody that says, I choose to be with this person, that when I'm with this person, I'm happy. But if you feel like you can't be without somebody, then it's really not, it's a dependence on that person, as opposed to me, as I see it.
Exactly. And same things for jobs. An employee who doesn't need the job will probably be a better employee because he will be more likely to push some things, to take a little bit of risk where it can bring good outcomes, to come with ideas and so on.
Yeah, boy, that just brought me back to, I think the bigger challenge for leaders today is that people are much more willing to walk away from their roles and try something else. And I think from a leadership perspective, it requires leaders to tap more into that expected emotional outcome. What's important to the employee? How do I satisfy that in the individual? Because they're more likely to say, I'm not doing this. I'll go somewhere else. There are plenty of opportunities right now that I don't have to be here.
Exactly. And I will tell you one thing. Most of people do not quit a job because they're looking for something else. They quit a job because the job got frustrating. And then, of course, they're looking something else because it's frustrating. The point is, as a leader, you can do much more for employee retention rather than looking for ways to keep people in your team, in your company, just by removing sources of frustration. So look for the excessively bureaucratic process. Look for the middle manager who's pissing off his people and so on, and solve those problems. And you will necessarily improve retention by a lot. And it would be much cheaper than offering them huge perks, organizing big events or whatnot.
Yeah. And again, we know that again, the research validates it, that in the long run is not what matters to people. Obviously, it has some relevance, but there are much simpler ways to get people to be engaged and want to be around. I think we've overcomplicated a lot of it.
Exactly.
So as we're sort of coming toward the end, you have a whole separate section of your book where you talk about sort of things that didn't make it into the actual book, but there are thoughts that you have, hypotheses. I'd be curious from your perspective first, is there any one in there that you continue to want to develop?
Well, one thing which I think should be really important to society is the chapter on mimetic societies. Basically, I'm making the point that all humans, we have the tendency to imitate others. And usually there is this common belief that it's something dumb. But actually, imitation is a very powerful strategy when there is skin in the game. So I make an example. In the past, imitation was a great strategy because if someone was eating the wrong kind of berries, was eating poisonous berries and die, he would not be around to be imitated anymore. So necessarily the pool of people that are around for you to copy are the people who survived and eventually thrived. So in the past, usually with skin in the game, imitation means copying successful strategies. Nowadays, instead, when there is much less skin in the game than in the past, there are so many people to imitate around. Few of them are doing good things. A lot of them are doing wrong things. And imitation in this case becomes a liability. But the problem is not imitation, it's the lack of skin in the game. And then we can talk about a lot of ways on how we can bring more skin in the game in society. But for me, that's the main reason. Like one of the big importances of skin in the game is because people will imitate. And so we need to make sure that only people who are doing the behaviors which are not harming society are left there to imitate.
Yeah, boy, I think of two things on that. One is the book Skin in the Game by Nicholas Nassim Taleb is such a fascinating book. And then secondly, I think of a quote that was by Jim Rohn, who said that we're the average of the 5 people that we associate with the most, right? And if we're looking for positive role models, or imitation, success leads clues, I guess, right? Is that follow those people that are successful at it now. And that's probably a good indicator of how you might be able to get there as well, I would think.
Exactly.
Right, along those lines. One that stuck out to me in that section was around narratives, is that we all have our own narratives that it's almost like we justify the decisions we make, right? We can tell ourselves our own stories. And again, I've seen this, as I'm sure you have, over the last 2 years we all have our own narratives of what's right and what's wrong in terms of all depending on what our beliefs are.
Exactly. And just a few minutes ago, I was making the example of myself wearing my gym shoes and going to take a run. And what happens a lot of times is that I decide to go for a run, and then I do not go running. And then I think that the reason why I didn't go running is because it's raining or because my knee is a bit painful. But these are all justifications. The only reason for why we don't take action is because the expected emotional outcome associated to that action was negative. Everything else is a justification. It's a narrative that our brain automatically constructs to bridge two dissonant concepts. One, which is that we wanted to go to run, and the other one is that we didn't go to run.
Yeah.
And the dissonance need to be bridged by narratives.
I don't know if you're familiar. There was a book that was written called The 5-Second Rule by Mel Robbins. And I'd be curious your thoughts on this, but her whole concept on this is that if we wait longer than 5 seconds, generally another part of our brain picks up and justifies why we should or shouldn't do something. Whereas if we don't give ourselves that amount of time, we're more likely just to take the action. We don't think of why we don't do it. And I've thought about that a lot. As a runner, I certainly am one of those that I can get dressed fully to go out for a run. And then I see some stuff on the counter that needs to be tidied up. And I go do that. And then I do something else. And next thing I know, I say, I don't have enough time to go for a run right now. I've got to now get ready for work. And I'll run at the end of the day. And I know that doesn't happen either, because the end of the day comes and I'll be like, just got too much on my plate. It's too close to dinner and I'll run tomorrow. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that there is definitely some truth to these 5-second rules. And to me, there is also like similar thought by Tony Robbins that stuck to me. I think that he says something, I'm paraphrasing, along the lines of, you should change your beliefs or change your objectives. But the thing is, you will know that you change the objectives or the beliefs the moment that you take action. If you think that you change your beliefs or objectives, but you're not taking immediate action, then it means that you didn't really change your beliefs and objectives. And I think that's totally true.
Yeah, interesting. I will say, I found interesting, I'm trying to figure out how I fit in this, because I will tell you, there aren't many runs that I go on that when I leave, I'm like, boy, I can't wait to go do this. But there is not one run that I've ever come back from within an hour of finishing it. I've said, I'm so glad I did that. I wouldn't trade that. I wouldn't have not run knowing what I know now an hour after I finished it. But there are plenty of times where I'm like, oh God, I don't want to do this, but I do it.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to reconcile that in regards to the expected emotional outcome. The initial part of the run for me is I don't want to do it, but I guess I'm one of those that I push to think of, I know the end result of this. I've played this movie enough times that I know the end result is going to be good. So I force myself through that.
Exactly. That's the thing. And the thing is that you know it unconsciously, because knowing it consciously, everyone probably knows it doesn't matter towards taking action. Yeah. It's whether you know it subconsciously. Yeah.
Yeah. Luca, this has been so fascinating and so valuable. And again, in terms of from an employment or a leadership perspective, I think so many things that we've talked about are so important and valuable, especially today. If people want to contact you, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yes, my email is luca@luca-dellanna.com, DELLANNA.com. Otherwise, you can just look for my website. There is a contact form. I personally read all emails. And yes, that's the best way to contact me. You can just Google for my name, Luca Dellanna, LucaDellanna, and then the contact form will pop up.
Yeah. And also, here it is right here. I will have this on the show notes as well. And I highly recommend, this is one of my favorite books that I've read. So thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss this. I think there are so many great pearls in here, much more than what we've talked about on this. There just are so many different ways we can go. So thank you for taking the time to be on the podcast.
Thank you, Patrick, so much for inviting me and for the discussion and all the suggestions.
Great. Wishing you all the best. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, please feel free to rate, review, and subscribe on your preferred podcast listening platform. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time, keep rising above your best as a leader.